Thank you. Nice to see you. Thank you all for turning out on Good Friday. It's a real genuine pleasure to be here, to be invited to speak to you. And before I begin, I want to say a huge thank you to the organisation itself. I think Lochaber Support for Palestine is one of those organisations which, along with so many across these islands, is determined to keep the plight of the Palestinian people on the political agenda, and is determined that the UK's complicity in what is happening in Gaza, and increasingly, sadly, in the West Bank, does not go unnoticed and does not go unchallenged. As we've just seen and heard for the past 19 months since the atrocities, let's call them what they are, the atrocities of October the 7th, the civilian population of Gaza has been subjected to the most brutal onslaught imaginable. Under the flimsy disguise of Israel's demand for security, unspeakable horrors have been put in place. And those horrors have been done with the complicity of the United States, and I am thoroughly ashamed to say the United Kingdom, who continue to supply Netanyahu and his regime with the weapons it needs to carry out these atrocities, and perhaps more importantly, supply Netanyahu with the political cover and that international legitimacy that he craves in order to justify what he's doing. And the statistics behind what he is doing are absolutely horrific. In excess of 50,000, I think fair to say, at very least 50,000 people have been killed. 70% of the dead being women and children. At least 120,000 have been injured. Again, the vast majority being women and children. And every single day in Gaza, 10 children lose at least one of their limbs. And it makes Gaza, this tiny strip of land, it makes that home to the largest population of child amputees in history. And that is something which does not happen by accident. 2 million people have been displaced, not just once or twice, 3, 4, countless number of times these people have been displaced while Israel systematically reduces Gaza and its infrastructure to rubble, making Gaza deliberately uninhabitable. And it is reckoned there's something approaching 50 million tonnes of bomb-damaged rubble where people's homes and businesses and places of worship used to be in this tiny strip of land. And it's been estimated that 4/5 of those who died were in residential buildings when they died. And you don't need to be a lawyer to know that targeting residential buildings is a crime under international law. But we all know, and we've seen since October the 7th of 2023, that Israel has violated international law time and time again. Almost on a daily basis, we have witnessed the most egregious breaches of international humanitarian law. We've had them play out in real time on our phones, on our tablets, and on our television screens. We have heard and we have seen the on-the-ground testimony from the United Nations, from medics, from journalists, from aid agencies, from the victims themselves, describing in minute detail the horror that they have suffered. And we also know, because Lord Cameron, when he spoke to the Foreign Affairs Committee back in January of 2024, let it slip. We also know that the United Kingdom have been aware from the very start that Netanyahu has been imposing a collective punishment on the people of Gaza by restricting access to water, fuel, power and medicine. And there's been ample evidence, so, that international law isn't just being manipulated or bent or breached. International law has been shredded, and it's so dangerous. And I will come back to that, the dangers of international law being applied in the way it is. But what I want to do is just look at, there have been so many examples, but what I want to do is just look at two examples, very recent breaches of international humanitarian law. On the morning of March the 18th, Israel decided it was going to shatter the fragile peace agreement by massacring 400 civilians. 400 civilians, again, mainly women and children, who were sheltering in tents or other makeshift structures. And on March the 23rd, 8 Palestinian Red Crescent volunteers, 6 civil defence first responders were shot and killed, their bodies dumped into a shallow grave with their hands tied behind their back. By any standard, and I mean any standard, that is a breach of international law. Done by any other country, at any other time, against any other group of people, this would have provoked outrage and it would have provoked repercussions. Had either of these atrocities, can you imagine these atrocities being committed by Russia or Iran or North Korea, indeed any other country in the world apart from Israel, then the UK government would quite rightly, at very least, have got the ambassador in, would have threatened sanctions, would have threatened to strip diplomatic relations. They would have done everything up to and including joining or being part of a coalition of the willing in order to make it stop. The UK government did absolutely nothing. It may have released yet another in a series of mealy-mouthed statements urging the reinstatement of the ceasefire and calling on Tel Aviv to investigate, essentially repeating everything that they'd done previously for the last 19 months. But the problem is that Israel knows the UK will not actually do anything. Israel understands that it has been given the freedom to bomb civilians, journalists, health workers, and impose a collective punishment in the full and certain knowledge that there will be no consequence or action taken against it. And what we saw in the events of March the 18th and again on March the 23rd is what impunity looks like. This is what happens when a country is given carte blanche to do what it likes to whoever it likes in order to achieve whatever it wants. And for Israel to commit these atrocities when a ceasefire was hanging by a thread was, as the UN humanitarian coordinator for the West Bank said, absolutely unconscionable. But in the last 19 months, what we have always regarded as unconscionable has actually become the commonplace. It's become almost routine. And the truth is, this UK government and the government which preceded it are absolutely complicit in it, and they have been from the start. The UK have and continue to supply weapons, intelligence, logistical support, knowing full well that Israel is in flagrant breach of international law. In the House of Commons on the morning of March the 20th, following the massacre of those 400 civilians, I asked the Foreign Secretary if he could think of any other conflict at any other point in history when the UK would have accepted one of its closest allies and one of its military partners designating babies and toddlers as being military targets. His reply, as he always is, was dismissive, but what he went on to say I thought was very, very revealing, because he inadvertently admitted and I quote, "There are atrocities on both sides of this conflict." And of course, he was correct, as I've said, the atrocities of October the 7th was a heinous act, and I think any right-thinking person couldn't look at October the 7th and dismiss it as acceptable, because you could not defend or excuse it. But the big difference, of course, is that the massacre of October the 7th was perpetrated by Hamas, a designated terrorist organisation, while Israel remains one of the UK's closest friends, as well as being one of our highly valued military partners. And while recognising that there are atrocities on both sides, it surely must call into question, if there are atrocities on both sides, why is the UK arming one of the combatants in that conflict? And it was on that basis I wrote to the Attorney General, seeking his legal opinion as to why the UK is continuing to sell weapons either directly to Israel or as part of a supply chain which it knows that Israel will be the end user of those weapons. Why, if we accept that Israel is committing atrocity crime, are we selling weapons? And I asked about the legal implications of us doing that, and then also providing that non-lethal assistance of reconnaissance, surveillance flights, training, intelligence support. And I finally got an answer. And the answer from the Attorney General was, "This is not my problem. I have sent your letter to David Lammy." Now, if I'd wanted David Lammy to correct his own homework, I'd have written to David Lammy. The reason I wrote to the Attorney General is because, as his chief legal officer, he must have a legal opinion on the legitimacy or otherwise of the UK supplying weapons to a regime which the Foreign Secretary is on record as saying is guilty of atrocity crime. And I highlight that exchange not just because it's so recent, but because it illustrates the veil of secrecy behind which the UK government operate. There's a complete lack of transparency to the extent of them actually refusing to answer the most basic questions. And to illustrate that point further, a few months ago, I wrote to the Ministry of Defence. As you know, the Ministry of Defence has sanctioned reconnaissance flights over Gaza. And I wrote to them, and I specifically said I didn't want to know what information they had gathered, but I wanted to know, could they reassure me that if the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice or the United Nations were to launch an investigation into war crimes, atrocity crimes, or genocide in Gaza, would that footage be made available to those organisations? The MOD simply refused to answer. So we have no idea if that footage that they have gathered will be made available to the authorities if and when they ask for it. And that's what those tiny number of committed members of Parliament who will shine a light where too many people don't want a light to be shone, that's what we are faced with every day from this government. Obfuscation, avoidance and deflection. We had it under the Tories, and I'm sorry to say it's exactly the same under this Labour government. I mean, perhaps naively, and despite of the overwhelming evidence to the contrary, we had hoped that things might be different and that things would improve with a change of UK government. And probably the kindest thing I could say is that in terms of Israel, Palestine and the UK's upholding of international law, is that long before they came to power, Keir Starmer and David Lammy had set themselves a pretty low bar, and I'm sorry to say they are struggling to even reach the low bar that they'd set for themselves, because they know They know as well as you and I that Netanyahu and his regime are committing war crimes. They're routinely breaching international humanitarian law. And if the evidence of their own eyes didn't tell them that, then the United Nations has told them that. The International Criminal Court has told them that. The International Court of Justice has made that abundantly clear to them. But they will not act. And part of the reason that they won't act is because they do not want to incur the wrath of the United States and make the United Kingdom even more isolated than it already is. They will not act because the power of the Israeli lobby in the United Kingdom, it's absolutely all-pervasive. And the financial support that the Israeli lobby brings to political parties who are willing to do its bidding should never, ever be underestimated. And I also suspect that they won't act because they recognise that they're so far into this quagmire that their ego, both collective national ego and their personal egos, won't allow them to admit their complicity in these atrocities and find a way out. They will not act, and therefore remaining silent and being complicit is the option that they've chosen. As I said, the UK government will issue mealy-mouthed statements of condemnation and regret before returning to business as usual, providing Netanyahu with the military and political support that it needs. And I alluded earlier, the point I want to come on to is that what we and our allies are doing or not doing will have profound consequences far beyond this current conflict. These are incredibly dangerous times for liberal democracy, and our unwillingness to adequately defend those core principles of individual rights, freedom, the rule of law, equality before the law, all because Israel wants to pursue its genocide of the Palestinian people, will change the world as we know it. I mean, even before Trump and his dismantling of American democracy, and before he embarked on this insane trade war, we were already seeing democratic states, particularly in the global south, throwing their lot in with anti-democratic authoritarian states for whom those values that we cherish mean absolutely nothing. And I do fear that history will record that the final nail in the coffin for liberal democracy was the West's response to the crisis in the Middle East. And Gaza has become the defining issue, not just here in the UK, but around the world. And it's the issue around which many in the global south have coalesced. Because it's not just the supplying of Israel with weapons it needs to prosecute its war. It's because we have permitted, indeed we have been complicit in allowing such a blatant standard in the application of international law. One which I said earlier essentially gives Israel carte blanche to act with impunity in Gaza. And I think that has removed any lingering doubt that people have had that the system of international law, while flawed, was basically fair. But the world can see that after October the 7th, international law hasn't just been manipulated or bypassed, it has been sacrificed. Since October the 7th, I've spoken to government ministers in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt, and other places, and they have spoken of the unprecedented levels of anger among their population, particularly young people. Not just at Israel's action, but at our duplicity in changing the rules purely to protect our friends. And, not just speaking to politicians, but speaking to taxi drivers, speaking to students, speaking to clerics, speaking to, liberal pro-democracy activists across the Middle East. The story is the same. From Saudi Arabia to Qatar to Egypt The story is the same, that the Islamic world is furious because once and for all, the confirmation is there that international law is no longer a level playing field. And they're right. It's so transparent. I recall back in September last year, after a missile struck a residential building, Annalise Dodds, when she was Minister of State at the Foreign Office, I remember her saying, I've got the quote here, it says, "Intentionally directing attacks at civilian objects is a war crime. Those attacks threaten civilian access to power, heating and water, impacting the safety and livelihoods of millions of Ukrainians." And of course she was absolutely right. She's absolutely right. But why is the UK able, indeed eager, to call out Putin's war crimes the moment they happen, but they seem utterly incapable of doing so when the perpetrator is Netanyahu and the victim is a Palestinian? And let's be clear, whether we call this refusal to defend international law realpolitik or just plain old moral cowardice, it is and it will continue to have huge repercussions. Because if we pick and choose the war crimes we condemn, we don't just fail the victims, we ensure the destruction of that system of international law altogether. There must be, there has to be an absolute standard. And whether it's friend or foe, everyone must be judged to that same standard. But the world can see that that is now no longer the case. And tragically, international law has faltered at a time when the world needs a robust, transparent, even-handed application of the law more than ever before. I'm sorry for being and sounding so pessimistic, but this is what I have come, this is a position I've arrived at through 19 months of painful experience. But I will wrap up before we have a sort of question and answer session by saying there is hope. And the hope is in this room. The hope is that you, along with the tens of millions of people across these islands, across this continent and across the world, because you are so far ahead of the government and the governments on this issue. The people can see this for what it is. The people aren't blind. The people aren't stupid. And they're not prepared. We are not prepared to believe what the government wants us to believe because the evidence to the contrary is so blatant. And it is that, knowing that you are doing what you're doing, that keeps me and that small band of members of parliament like me going, because we see what you see. And no amount of gaslighting by the UK government and their propaganda outlets is going to change that. So don't ever underestimate the importance of what you do. Don't ever believe that because there are 35, 40 people in this room that you are not doing something. You are doing so much. I remember first time I ever went to West Bank, 2018, and I came back and I had never been somewhere or returned from somewhere that I believed was hopeless. And I was so down, so depressed, and so just lacking in hope. I thought, well, what can I do? And perhaps it's my Christian upbringing and my Christian belief that said, well, all you can do in these situations is bear witness. All you can do when all seems hopeless is go out and talk to people and tell people what you've seen and get people engaged and motivated, and hopefully they will pick up the cudgels and they'll do something and they'll speak to people. And so wrote to everyone I could think of in Argyll and Bute, saying, I want to come and talk to you. I've made a slideshow about my trip to the West Bank, and I want to talk to you about what I've seen. And I did a dozen different town halls. I remember going to the Kilmallie Women's, the Church of Scotland women's group in Kilmallie, and 14 women from the Kilmallie Parish Church sitting talking about Palestine, and that made me, that was such a cathartic experience. We've got to talk about it. We've got to talk to other people about it, because if we don't, they will win. And it's people power which will win. It has to, and I have to believe, because there is a genocide being played out in real time in front of our eyes. And we know that our government is complicit in it. And we have got to say loudly, clearly, and unambiguously, not in our name. And we will continue to do that for however long it takes, for no other reason than simply it is the right thing to do. Thank you very much for inviting me.